The East Blue Saga was a nice introduction into the series, but the world is about to become a lot bigger and the stakes will be raised even higher as the Straw Hats will now venture into the Grand Line. At first I was going to cover all the arcs in the Alabasta Saga up until the Alabasta Arc itself, but there really isn't too much to talk about within some of these arcs, so I decided to cover all of them in this video. Overall, I would put the entire saga above East Blue, as I think it's a bit more well-rounded and does a great job of expanding the world and introducing us to the dangers of the Grand Line. I'm going to cover each arc in order, and timestamps will be down below in case you want to skip to a particular arc that interests you. While the Reverse Mountain arc was a pretty short, uneventful arc, it served as the official introduction to the Grand Line and gives us many details about the unpredictable nature that we were told about back in East Blue. The weather doesn't follow any sort of regular pattern that Nami is used to seeing, and the crew ends up getting sent into a whale named Laboon, who just so happened to have an entire island and infrastructure built inside of him. I honestly can't believe that the 4Kids version just puts an iceberg in the way and basically shuts down multiple arcs with important world building and plot details relevant to the entire saga. I think this setting, along with the Baratie arc, highlights the diverse settings that One Piece uses, and it'll more than likely only get crazier as the Straw Hats continue traversing the Grand Line. Although there really isn't much focus on developing any characters, Luffy once again shows that despite his goofy personality, he's able to quickly understand the troubles that anyone may face and manages to give Laboon some genuine hope for the first time in decades, which was a nice wholesome moment. However, the real meat of this short arc comes from the introduction of the log pose and how navigation works on the Grand Line, and a seemingly unimportant rogue who has a much bigger role to play for the rest of the saga. I was pretty surprised to see a relatively in-depth explanation on how the log pose worked, and the idea of each island having their own magnetic field is really interesting. Also, I didn't expect a name drop for the endgame island where the One Piece is located, or for a not so subtle hint to be dropped that indicates some sort of connection between Luffy and Roger, although I'm not expecting either of those things to be explored in further detail for a long time. But this whole idea of dropping seemingly crucial elements so casually is pretty common for Oda, and I honestly really enjoy it, because it always keeps you on your toes for when the topic might be brought back up again. World building aside, Reverse Mountain was a relatively uneventful arc, but still enjoyable to watch. Even though it's much more action-packed, the Whisky Peak Arc isn't really the best display of intimidating power that the Grand Line may possibly present to the Straw Hats. So far, it really seems like the weather and unpredictability of the sea within the Grand Line has posed more of a threat to the crew than anything else. However, Whisky Peak serves as a nice setup for the rest of the events in the saga, but doesn't really do much else. It also feels like a bit more of a bland setting in comparison to a few of the other places we've seen already. But what I really did enjoy about this arc was the amount of unique abilities that were on display, character designs were great, and the comedy was on point. The arc officially introduces the criminal syndicate known as Baroque Works, but they really didn't seem to be much trouble considering Zoro dispatched almost all of them pretty easily, which is kind of a shame considering that some of them looked pretty cool. But it really does put into perspective how strong Zoro actually is when he isn't dealing with life-threatening injuries every 2 seconds. The point where the arc really starts coming together is when the twists and turns of events start coming in one after the other. When it is revealed that Miss Wednesday, a seemingly unimportant member of the organization, is actually both a spy and the princess of the Alabasta Kingdom, known as Vivi. Although for me, the biggest reveal was the identity of the leader of the organization, Crocodile, and the fact that he's one of the 7 warlords. I instantly got hyped up knowing that this was going to be the biggest battle of the series, and that it was going to happen relatively soon. As for the comedy, seeing everyone fail to present a threat to Zoro was really entertaining, but the best moment for sure was when Luffy and Zoro just destroyed Mr. 5 and Miss Valentine while trying to literally kill each other over a dumb misunderstanding. There was also the reveal of Miss All Sunday, aka Nico Robin, who at the time was simply a mysterious character with a pretty OP Devil Fruit ability. Outside of the fights and setup though, characters like Sanji and Usopp are completely ignored for the entire arc, and not much really happens in terms of development for the others who are involved. Regardless, Whisky Peak was a nice little arc that continues to show off One Piece's quality world building, and that was more than enough to keep me entertained. I really enjoyed Little Garden, and it's the first time in the saga that the Straw Hats face some kind of adversity. Although the prehistoric jungle setting may not exactly be the most unique environment, it does serve a purpose, which to illustrate that no 2 islands on the Grand Line develop the same way for multiple reasons. The climate, dinosaurs, dueling giants, and the 1-year requirement for the log pose to set a new course makes it impossible to evolve. As for the Giants, although I could see where the Dory and Brogy dynamic was going, I liked their friendly rivalry and they were enjoyable characters. More importantly though, this was the first time that we got to see Usopp really put himself in the midst of all the action this time. He honestly kinda saved the entire crew from becoming a bunch of wax sculptures. Oda subtly planting a potential storyline to explore with Usopp taking an interest in the Giants' culture and wanting to become a brave warrior was a nice touch. The other Straw Hats take more of a backseat role and are just kind of there, which was a bit disappointing. It already happened to Sanji once, and even though he ends up talking with Crocodile himself, he doesn't do much else. Vivi's perspective of the Straw Hats was interesting to see, and the way she slowly but surely gets more familiar and friendly with the crew was well done. There's a mix of new and returning antagonists that put up much more of a fight this time around, with Mr. 3 leading the charge. I didn't really find any of the antagonists to be compelling, so I just decided to focus on who had the coolest abilities to get more enjoyment out of the entire arc. Out of all of their abilities, I found Miss Golden Week's power to be the most creative and OP of the entire bunch, and yet she still lost to Karoo. Mr. 3 had an interesting Devil Fruit power, but I just think his character design and dialogue kind of downplayed the threat level that his ability presented. Not as much done on the world building aspect aside from introducing giants into the series. I would say Little Garden is at a similar level of quality for me as Whisky Peak was, but things are about to get a bit more interesting. So after completing entire sagas, I like to go and see what the general consensus is on the arcs that I get through. And I was honestly shocked to see that so many people aren't really big fans of the Drum Island arc. It's on the low end for quite a lot of people, and I can kind of see why, but it seems a little harsh. Maybe the way the anime handles it isn't that great, but to me, Drum Island was my favorite arc in the Alabasta Saga up until this point. I think this is one of the reasons why people like One Piece so much. Many people have different experiences with the series, and the arcs that I rate higher than others can be vastly different from someone else's perspective and still make sense. I can see why some people don't like it that much, and I do share a lot of the same complaints, such as the setting not exactly being too eye-catching, even though the snow environment is refreshing to see at the start and shows off the different climates and seasons within the Grand Line. Also, Wapol isn't exactly the most intimidating or likable antagonist, but then again, I really haven't been too invested in any antagonist in One Piece so far. On top of that, multiple characters are ignored for most of the arc, except for Luffy and Sanji. The main problem though is that the arc has nothing to do with what's going on in the Alabasta Saga. While the other arcs act as a setup for Alabasta, Drum Island feels disconnected from them. The selling point of this arc for me though was the backstory of Chopper. It seems like not too many people were a fan of Chopper's character, which might simply be because his voice in the anime is kind of grating on my ears. Just another benefit of reading the manga, honestly. But Chopper's backstory is the first one in the series to be really explored in detail and tell us how and why Chopper ended up becoming a doctor in the first place. Most backstories for anybody that's in the crew right now have lasted up to one chapter max, and it's not like Chopper's story is one that's particularly unique. The idea of feeling like an outcast and being a monster and rejected by everyone is one of the oldest stories out there, but it's the dynamic that Chopper shares with Dr. Hidelook which made the backstory much more enjoyable and entertaining for me. And on top of that, it does a great job of fleshing out the entire story and lore within Drum Island, and how everything became worse in the first place. Other than that, there are some big teasers such as Gold Roger's name actually being Gold D. Roger, which is the same way Luffy's name is formatted, and Dr. Kureha mentions the Will of D. Probably not gonna know about that for a long time. Although Drum Island isn't exactly a groundbreaking arc, I appreciated Oda's in-depth characterization of Chopper since it felt different from the style he usually goes for. But it's time to move on to the climax of the saga where everything starts coming together. I've been enjoying the One Piece journey so far, but I'll be honest and say that I still never had that moment where I could say that I was fully invested and hyped. But that has now changed after the Alabasta arc. For me, this is the best arc in One Piece so far, and it's not even close. The entire saga has been building up to this point, and it all comes together extremely well. The stakes are much higher, with an entire kingdom filled with millions of people engaging in a civil war, fueled by manipulation and misunderstandings. Every single one of the Straw Hats gets their own moment in the spotlight. We finally have a villain that actually feels like a legitimate and powerful threat within the Grand Line, and tons of cool unique abilities get introduced. I'm going to try and divide everything I talk about relating to this arc into different sections so it's easier to follow along, because there's a lot of stuff to go into here. Just from the setting alone, Alabasta has much more on the line in comparison to any other arc. Back in East Blue, we were simply dealing with some small villages that were in danger. All of Alabasta's cities are much larger than any setting we've encountered so far and all have their own unique architecture. Technically, Drum Island is a kingdom, but it feels more barren with much fewer people. Whereas the Alabasta Kingdom has millions of people who are all at each other's throats and have suffered from Crocodile's long-term manipulation. At first, the arc begins relatively calm. but due to Vivi's worries for her people, there's a sense of urgency and tension that grows very quickly. Oda manages to keep this tension throughout the entire arc and amplify it even further by putting a timer on the Straw Hats to stop all of Crocodile's plans. The constant shifting from one Straw Hats battle to the next, all simultaneously occurring over the span of minutes, heavily reminds me of Hunter x Hunter's Chimera Ant arc, but with much faster pacing. Even though One Piece is a shonen at the end of the day, and the Straw Hats will end up winning, the goal is to make the events leading up to that victory as tense and entertaining as possible, and Oda managed to do exactly that with a different approach. This section has the most to unpack by far. In terms of newer characters, we got to see Ace in action, who just got teased at the end of Drum Island. I was pretty surprised to see him make a brief appearance in this arc, but he's a character that I want to see again, and I want to know more about him and his backstory. I also really like Chaka and Pell and the respect they have for Cobra and the dedication they had to protect the kingdom above all else. Especially Pell, when he ultimately sacrifices his own life in order to save everyone else's. But Cobra was the character that really surprised me. Usually in animes, anyone who is in a position of power is corrupt, naive, and antagonistic towards their people. This can be seen throughout One Piece as well. Anyone who thinks they're the top dog eventually receives a massive beatdown from Luffy and they're taken down a notch. But Cobra was one of the most likable rulers I think I've seen. He always kept a calm, rational train of thought no matter how bad things got, and his concern for his people came first before anything else. He's humble, compassionate, and was willing to let the capital and palace all be destroyed so long as it would stop the rebellion. And the most important thing, he gave the boys a little peek to where the women's baths were, disregarding the fact that his own daughter was there as well. Regarding Vivi, I really came around to liking her character in this arc. Similar to her father, the devotion she has to her people and desperately wanting to do whatever she can to avoid any bloodshed was noble. And she did save most of the Straw Hats when they were all captured by Crocodile, so she definitely had an important role to play. I didn't think much of Koza, but I'm glad that Oda put in a character to get a much clearer understanding of how the rebels feel. I still don't have much of an opinion on Robin, but I did feel like she was a character that had her own agenda, and I didn't expect her to tag along with the rest of the Straw Hats. Speaking of which, every Straw Hat had some time to shine, with some making bigger strides in development. Luffy receives his biggest challenge in fighting Crocodile, but I'll get into that a bit later. Even though Luffy's stubborn and goofy personality gets the crew into much more trouble than need be, it's that same insistence of wanting to assist any of his friends that helps him overcome his toughest challenge. I really liked Luffy's argument with Vivi where he tells her that she's being naive, thinking she can save absolutely everyone without bloodshed, and that they should just attack Crocodile head on, which was pretty wise. The most important bit of characterization, though, is finding out Luffy is a true advocate of gender equality. As for the other characters, I'll go through their respective battles during the arc one by one. Nami's had the most weight in terms of what it meant for her character. We've rarely seen Nami participate in any of the battles because she's too weak. However, she had no choice but to fight against Miss Doublefinger alone. She had to try and find a way to make Usopp's weapon work for her, even if party tricks were the only thing on his mind when he made it. Although the fight wasn't particularly exciting, the purpose of it was for Nami to overcome her mental hurdle of feeling like the weakest link. Meanwhile, Usopp and Chopper had the most creative fight of the bunch, going up against number 4 and Miss Merry Christmas. I love the fight from the very moment I saw the half-dog, half-RPG weapon that shoots exploding baseballs. This fight really shows off just how wacky these devil fruits can get, by being able to merge with inanimate objects and be deadly viable weapons. It's a toss-up for me between Zoro and Sanji's fights for which one I thought was the best, but I think I have to go with Sanji's. I think it had the best blend of craziness, comedy, and action, which puts it above Zoro's for me. Bon Clay was unquestionably my favorite of the Baroque Works agents, with his flamboyant personality and his lack of care for the people he works with in the organization. He just marches to the beat of his own drum. I didn't expect Bon Clay to be such a tough opponent, but it was a really even battle between him and Sanji. The fight was made much more difficult for Sanji due to the fact that he's not a gender equality advocate like Luffy. As for Zoro, his fight was also evenly matched, and the moment where he managed to finally cut Mr. One and cut through steel was great. So many different abilities on display throughout all these fights made the arc so much more entertaining. Crocodile is the first One Piece villain that I've actually been interested and invested in. He's not a complex character with tons of development and deep-rooted motivations, but he's the first character to feel like a legitimate threat and represent the powerful foes that the Straw Hats will regularly face while traversing the Grand Line. I'm pretty sure at one point he literally says that he's built different, and he definitely lives up to that title of being a warlord of the sea. His ideology doesn't differ much from other villains we've seen, but it's his methodical planning and ruthlessness that takes him to the next level. He has no regard for any of the millions of lives within the kingdom and was willing to put them through years of suffering and tear them all down just to seize control. He beat Luffy not only once, but twice, and the only reason why Luffy even lived was because Nico Robin saved him the first time, and then he just got insanely lucky the second time. His Devil Fruit power was really cool to see, and it gave him this aura of invincibility for quite a while. It was extremely versatile, and he knew the ins and outs of how to make the most of it. Overall, Crocodile has been the best villain of the series so far, and I hope the quality of the villains keeps going up. There are more world building details I can talk about in the Alabasta arc, such as the introduction of the poneglyphs, the true history, the Will of D being briefly mentioned again, and that mysterious card Ace gave Luffy before he left. But I assume these will all become important much later. I definitely rate the Alabasta Saga higher than East Blue, and I want the series to keep this momentum going. However, I have heard that people aren't the biggest fans of the next saga, but we'll see what happens. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. Please leave a like if you enjoyed, subscribe, all that good stuff, and let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Once again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.